Not many people know this, but in the 1990s, there was a teenage Boy Scout in Detroit named David Hahn, who was so obsessed with chemistry and nuclear energy that he spent a decade trying to build a working nuclear reactor in his backyard potting shed using radioactive materials he ordered from catalogs. And the craziest thing, it actually kind of worked. We often mythologize the idea of obsession, of unwavering vision, the quiet, intense dignity of never compromising. But what about the darker side of obsessively committing to your work? The stories that aren't told because the person's dedication ruined them, drove them into utter obscurity. What about when you go so deep into your passion that you drown and have nothing to show for it? What if this happened to a kid? And if even one adult in their life had shown a modicum of care or attention, it might have meant this kid becoming the most legendary figure of their generation. This is the story of David Hahn, the radioactive Boy Scout. David Hahn was born on October 30th, 1976 to Ken and Patty Hahn in suburban Detroit. Ken was a mechanical engineer at a General Motors subcontractor, and Patty was a stay-at-home mom. Ken, consumed by the social mores of the bustling Detroit automobile industry and the dutiful working-class culture it encouraged, was rarely home. Father and son rarely interacted, and when they did, it was extremely surface-level stuff. How was school, son? Good. You need me to change your diaper? Dad, I'm 10. David's mom, Patty, however, was obsessed with David. Her entire world revolved around doting on him. But during all this time, things weren't as they seemed to the blissfully unaware young David. In reality, his mother was silently struggling with a slow, creeping onset of mental illness. A few years after he was born, Patty started hearing voices and was diagnosed with chronic depression and paranoid schizophrenia. When David was 4 years old, her condition had gotten so bad that she was temporarily committed to a mental institution. Gone for months, this was the beginning of the end for David's idyllic, carefree childhood. After several months, Patty eventually returned to the Hahn household, and it was a glorious reunion for David. But things were never quite the same. David, who once had a life full of fun and love with daily activities and more attention than he knew what to do with, was now alone. A mode of existence that would recalibrate the trajectory of his life and define his legacy. Alone. In his room, without anybody or anything to bounce off of, reverberated out into infinity. Throughout these years, though, Ken and Patty's marriage was slowly crumbling. David would sit in his room, peering out into the living room as his parents screamed at each other. And inevitably, by the time David was 9, the Hahn family was officially broken. Ken and Patty got a divorce and moved out of David's childhood home. Patty lost custody of David due to her previous history with mental illness. He instead went to live with his dad. Shortly after the divorce, Ken started dating a fellow GM engineer named Kathy, and after a year, they moved into a house together in the Detroit suburb of Clinton Township. David suddenly had a new stepmom as well as an older sister, Kathy's daughter, Christina. On weekends, however, David got to go stay with his mom in the nearby suburb of Commerce Township. She'd moved there with her new boyfriend, Michael, a retired GM forklift driver, and offered a brief respite for David from the dull, disconnected daily life of his father's house. But things weren't exactly ideal in Commerce Township either. Patty still deeply struggled with her alcoholism and mental illness, and Michael was also somewhat of a heavy drinker. Over the years, David began to drift further and further from his family, instead making friends at school and spending his days out on the basketball courts or riding bikes across the landscape of 1980 suburban Detroit. Just really Stranger Things-ing it up. Just going full Spielberg on the thing. David was frequently caught letting the air out of people's tires and once started a fire in the woods that got so bad the fire department had to be called. So he went straight from Spielberg to John Hughes in like 90 seconds. He skipped right over his Goonies phase. And yes, I'm gonna keep making these references. All the while, throughout David's ups and downs, his struggling home life, his bouts of destructive behavior, there was one constant. Nobody cared. Not a single adult in his life took interest in anything he was doing. All except one. Oddly enough, it was Kathy, his stepmom's father, John Sims, that took notice of David's talents and decided to help him. And that's why one year, as a gift, he gave David the Golden Book of Chemistry, a massive tome chock full of descriptions of different chemical compounds and their effects on each other, as well as hundreds of science experiments that could be conducted in the home using basic household items. David instantly fell in love with the book, poring over and memorizing its wealth of knowledge of the world of organic chemistry. The only problem? The book was actually published in 1960, and its plethora of home science experiments weren't exactly safe. With the combination of pre-Cold War optimism and lack of modern safety regulation, the Golden Book of Chemistry and its included experiments made any present-day science book for children look like a book on how to take a nap during a pillow fight in the public library. The book had kids mixing real chemicals together to get explosive reactions, and explained in great detail how to extract radioactive material from common household items such as old-fashioned clocks and smoke detectors. So, from a time whenever we could have fun. He also learned about Marie and Pierre Curie, the godmother and father of nuclear science, in the pages of the Golden Book. And from that point on, they became his heroes. After reading and rereading the Golden Book, David set up his very first laboratory in the bedroom of his father's house in Clinton Township. He used every cent he had to buy up supplies for conducting experiments, including actual chemicals such as sodium hydroxide, potassium nitrate, sodium nitrate, ammonia, sulfur, and magnesium. Using the pages of the Golden Book, he started combining these materials to get different kinds of chemical reactions. And because David was a kid with very little prior knowledge of any of these chemicals, and the book he was using was written like it was from the perspective of a dude who just wanted a bunch of children to die in freak accidents all across the country, David seemed to have zero concept of the danger he was often putting himself in. David Hahn was living the life of Wile E. Coyote on a daily basis, except the roadrunner he was trying to catch was sadness and a lost childhood, which is super depressing. For instance, there was the time he, with the guidance of the Golden Book, casually concocted homemade chloroform in his bedroom. For that experiment, the Golden Book recommended that the reader sniff the forbidden elixir to get a sense of its complex aroma. But David sniffed a little too much and essentially ended up roofying himself, waking up on the floor of his bedroom minutes later, having no idea what happened. The best his father managed to do was realize that his increasingly reclusive son needed some kind of new outlet to socialize and work out his energy. And because Ken had been in the Boy Scouts as a child and loved it, he figured it would be the best option to whip David into shape. Despite David's protests, Ken forced him to join Troop 371 in Clinton Township. At first, David didn't want to do it. He thought the Scouts were for nerds, and he didn't exactly need any more reasons for the kids at school to taunt him. Plus, he foresaw it eating into his precious laboratory time. However, upon going out on his first few Scout excursions, he quickly realized that he actually loved it. He liked the camping trips, the group activities, and the fact that since Ken had such an affection for Scouts, it was one of the only times that he would actually show an interest in David's life, frequently accompanying him to Scout meetings and trips and spending some of the only quality time the two had ever had together. So David Hahn's life was literally like that Chevy Chase movie from the 90s, Man of the House, if instead of Jonathan Taylor Thomas, it starred Data from the Goonies. However, the thing he really loved about Troop 371 were the merit badges. He loved learning about new skills and working to earn trophies proving he'd mastered them. Most of all, he loved the fact that one of the badges he could earn was in chemistry. And David realized something important. He could take advantage of Ken's nostalgia and love for the Scouts in order to use his pursuit of the Chemistry Scout badge as a catch-all excuse to conduct all of his experiments at home. David's earliest close calls and mishaps included the time he was messing with a gas stove and it exploded, giving him second-degree burns across his arm. He was also really obsessed with trying to invent a new kind of self-tanning technology that could darken a person's skin without the need for the sun, because he was very concerned about getting sunburns for some reason. Once he overdosed on a chemical called canthaxanthin, which can stimulate skin pigment, and ended up going on a scout trip with bright orange skin and hair that didn't wear off for several days. But the danger would only get worse from here, as David decided he'd outgrown his bedroom laboratory at his dad's house and expanded to a backyard potting shed at his mom's. Between the new location and a private outdoor facility, as well as his mom and Michael's much more lax and unattentive approach to parenting, if that could even be believed considering everything you've heard about Ken so far, David was free to do crazier and crazier experiments in the potting shed. This was the turning point when David's experiments started to go from just a danger to his own health and well-being to something that could have catastrophic effects for everyone. As David got into high school and had access to more advanced science classes, more expensive equipment and materials that he wasn't able to find on his own, and the mentorship of a few of his teachers, David quickly absorbed more and more knowledge of chemistry. And much like every other stage of his scientific evolution, this meant more dangerous acts. Once in a science class, David mixed two chemicals in an attempt to create an exothermic reaction, or rapid heating, But he got the mixture wrong, and the concoction quickly heated, spilled over, filled the room with toxic smoke, and scorched the table. It was chaos as kids quickly ran out of the room, fearing some kind of explosion. Incidents like this led to increased isolation from his peers, being labeled as Dork Boy and Science Boy by the other kids at school. Super unique and creative nicknames. Hey look, that kid likes to do science. Oh, what are you, some kind of science boy? Come on. If you're gonna bully, at least do it right. Eventually he was bullied, and David would often find himself getting beat up by larger boys. So here's a little joke for you. What's a science outcast with an extreme interest in chemistry and science to do when he starts getting beat up at school? Did you say start hiding out in lesser trafficked areas during lunch and avoiding certain routes home? No. The answer is get swole. David got his dad to buy him a weight set, and he started working out every day during the time he wasn't studying or conducting his experiments. Eventually, he built a muscular physique and started fighting back when kids would pick on him. It wasn't long until people started leaving him alone and his bullying issues completely went away. Things were getting worse for David at home, though. He was becoming increasingly isolated from his father, Kathy, and his sister Christina in Clinton Township. And while his time at his mother's was at least bolstered by a little more love and affection, her and her boyfriend Michael's increased alcoholism and her deepening mental illness were also taking a toll on their relationship. Ken started to become concerned that even the scouts weren't doing enough to get David to be more sociable and encouraged him to get an after-school job. David tried out a number of different part-time jobs before finally settling on being a bag boy at a local Kroger grocery store, or Ralph's if you're West Coast nasty. When he was at work, he wasn't particularly committed to the job and would frequently wander off to explore the aisles of Kroger, obsessively poring over the ingredients of products on the shelves, memorizing their chemical makeup so he could attempt to recreate them at home. One day, another employee knocked over a large pallet of ammonia in the store. The massive amount of spilled chemicals quickly sent up a large toxic cloud of fumes that spread across the entire grocery store, sending customers gasping for air. Some fled the store, but others were hit so hard by the fumes, which can cause blisters in the throat and sometimes even death from too much exposure, that they collapsed to the floor, unable to escape the noxious cloud. However, David happened to know the exact chemical composition of ammonia, as well as the fact that it could be neutralized using a certain type of acid, and without even skipping a beat, immediately ran to the home aisle and grabbed several bottles of a specific toilet bowl cleaner he knew contained high levels of hydrochloric acid. He ran over to the ammonia spill and dumped the bottles of cleaner onto the mess, which had an immediate reaction of almost entirely neutralizing the fumes. David had used his chemical knowledge to save the day, and possibly a few lives. So, he got a hero's welcome and the admiration of all the customers and the entire staff of Kroger, right? No. His boss, having no idea that what David did had any correlation to the dissipation of the toxic fumes, fired him on the spot. David turned in his apron and left Kroger in defeat. Luckily, another employee called Poison Control to ask what they needed to do to clean up the mess, and the person on the phone told them to go and dump the exact toilet bowl cleaner David had used onto the spill. Realizing that David had actually done the right thing, the manager called him up and begrudgingly offered him his job back. Around this time, having filled out to a lean 5'9" with what people described as a winning smile, David had his first luck in the romance department and started dating a fellow student in his high school named Heather. He actually took being a boyfriend very seriously. Heather, for her part, was smitten with David, but much like everybody else in his life, had little interest in his chemical hobby. Once Heather started taking David home to meet her mom, she also thought he was a sweet, caring boy. The family's general positive opinion on David started to slowly shift, however, on the night that Heather received an emergency phone call from him. He was at home and told her that there had been an explosion that had left him with several burns all over his body. Alan and Heather rushed over to David's house in Clinton Township to check on him, assuming that there'd been some kind of gas leak or an appliance in his house had blown up, only to discover that the explosion had been as a result of one of his failed experiments. Even worse, Ken arrived home around the same time that Alan and Heather showed up, and his behavior shocked them. Ken casually strolled into the house and checked on David in a nonchalant way. When he discovered that David's burns were relatively minor and nothing in the house had been too badly damaged, he just casually strolled into the kitchen to make himself a sandwich. Apparently, David didn't fall too far from the tree, just a couple of unbothered kings. After this incident, David wasn't allowed to talk about his experiments in front of her parents, and when he'd get off too far on one of his lectures, she'd give him that concerned, tight-lipped smile, and he'd know to change the subject. We all know that smile. Fellas. We all know that smile. Fellas. We know it. Without even his loving girlfriend to confide in, David's experiments and research became stranger and more obsessive. During one of his many excursions into sunless skin tanning, he discovered a hormone that could stimulate melanin in the skin and cause natural darkening. But the hormone could only be found in the pituitary gland of a cow. So, naturally, he went to a local slaughterhouse, greased the palm of one of the employees, and started buying freshly severed cow skulls off him for $10 a pop so he could harvest the hormone. You know, regular stuff a teenage boy gets into, which is apparently trying to recreate the movie Soul Man. No? Nobody's ever seen Soul Man? Just me? Oh, probably for the best. Don't look into it. David started experimenting with the hormone by scraping off large chunks of his skin with a knife and observing how it reacted to it. And apparently the results were promising, according to David. The most surprising thing about this is that David's experiments actually paralleled the real research into sunless tanning that was going on at legitimate research firms at the same time in the US and Australia. Something that David, in a pre-internet age, couldn't have possibly known. And the weirder his experiments got, the more he pushed his friends and family away, the more isolated he became. Even Heather, who had no intention of breaking up with David at the time, just ultimately wanted to wash her hands of that side of his life. One time, he convinced her to come with him to his mom's house so he could show her his potting shed lab for the first time. And upon arriving, David discovered that a raccoon had gotten into the shed and messed around with some of its chemicals with its little raccoony teeth, which caused an explosion, completely mutilating it. That was enough for Heather, and she never returned to the potting shed. Ken and Kathy were pushing him further and further away as well. Ken was at his wit's end. He didn't know what else to do to straighten David up. The last thing he could think of was that maybe the scouts were the way out of all of this. It was the one interest that Ken and David shared. Either way, though, instead of, talking to David about his interests, why he was interested in chemistry, what he was doing, what he was trying to accomplish, how Ken and the rest of his family could help him pursue these passions in a safer, less volatile way. Instead, Ken just wanted to push him further away from it, ignore it, distract from it, win by attrition rather than have a genuine heart-to-heart conversation with his own son. So one day, Ken sat David down and talked to him about achieving the ultimate goal, attaining his Eagle Scout status. Little did he know, it'd be the worst mistake he would ever make. So how does one become an Eagle Scout? Only 2% of Boy Scouts ever make it that far, and it's accomplished through a rigorous series of trials. You have to earn 21 total merit badges from a possible 100 different topics. 11 of the badges are mandatory subjects such as family living, citizenship, and survival skills. The other 10 can be any subject the Scout chooses. And do you want to guess one of the badges that David chose? Yeah. Atomic energy. His pursuit of this badge would not only deepen his passion for the subject, but also equip him with many more skills to do even more destructive and even more dangerous things. During this time, one of his scoutmasters taught him how to use a Geiger counter and showed him where to find and harvest trace amounts of radioactive material from the numbers on vintage clocks, which used to be painted with radium so they glow in the dark. It was during this time that he developed a new goal in life. He was going to collect every single element on the periodic table. Yep. In the 90s, while other kids were trying to catch all 151 Pokemon, which came out after this, but I just couldn't resist making the joke, David was literally trying to catch them all, where the all was a collection of the most deadly substances known to man. I don't know who created the app Pokemon Go, but I just want to get them to Pokemon Go to the hospital for blowing their own face up. David also confided in his favorite high school chemistry teacher, Sue Young, but she also didn't take him seriously. That was until one day, during an open house event at the school, David's father visited Sue Young carrying a small paper bag. He hesitantly approached the teacher, opened up the bag, and produced a small jar of oil with some kind of white, waxy substance floating in it. He told her that he found it in David's room and wanted to know what it was. Young was horrified to realize that it was a chunk of pure sodium, a substance that, when exposed to air or water, would explode. It can only be contained in a stable state if suspended in oil, and it was only by sheer miracle that Ken or Kathy hadn't thought to open the jar and take the sodium out upon discovering it. And how the hell did he even get it? Well, David came up with a very interesting way of attaining the sodium, as well as other dangerous, illegal compounds and chemicals that he amassed over the next few years. He came up with the extremely discreet alter ego of Professor David Hahn, a Detroit high school chemistry teacher who wrote letters to government departments, colleges, and chemical companies asking to be sent materials so that he could demonstrate them to his classroom, using the sob story that his school couldn't afford them. Which, to be fair, is an extremely good excuse and very believable. First, he went around to a bunch of camping and military surplus stores and bought as many gas lanterns as he could get his hands on. Then he found out about another surplus vendor that was willing to sell broken and defective smoke detectors in bulk for cheap, and he bought all of those. David, or Professor David Hahn, also convinced one company to send him what became his pride and joy, his very own Geiger counter. From that moment on, David kept the counter mounted onto the dashboard of his car and took it wherever he went. And huge boxes of strange surplus supplies showing up on their doorstep, and David riding around town strapped with a Geiger counter? Well, David had the perfect excuse to immediately set Kin's mind at ease. It was all part of his merit badge. So what now? Where could he go from here? He didn't exactly have a goal. He just loved chemicals and figuring out how they worked. But what was his mission? The thing that would propel him to the level of scientific greatness experienced by his heroes, the Curies. He didn't actually have a clue. He was literally just winging it and following the dopamine. That was until one day he was flipping through one of his father's textbooks and stumbled across something called a breeder reactor. The breeder is a type of nuclear reactor that can generate more nuclear fuel than it consumes, which would essentially be an unlimited power source. Self-generating, unlimited, clean nuclear energy. Bye-bye world hunger, energy crisis, climate change, and oatmeal raisin cookies that first seem like chocolate chip cookies, maybe? Hopefully? Actually, I hate to admit this, but I've kind of warmed on oatmeal cookies recently, and David already had access to the materials he needed to build one. Why hadn't anyone done this before? Was David really the first one to attempt to build one of these miracle machines? He'd be world famous. A hero. David had no idea that breeder reactors, at least the self-perpetuating kind, were science fiction. A theoretical concept that had never been successfully created in the real world. Anytime he came across anything even remotely negative about nuclear energy in his reading, he just avoided it, just stuck his head in the sand like a ostrich fictionally does in that urban legend that's not actually true. Sorry, I couldn't just leave that hanging. But all he needed was enough uranium to cause a chain reaction by passing neutrons through it with a neutron gun. Easy peasy, melting guy from the end of RoboCop squeezy. And keep in mind, if even one single adult had at any point during all of this said, "Hey, what you doing there, bud?" this could have all been prevented. Maybe we'd all know the name Professor David Hahn, not as a fake alias used to scam government organizations out of their radioactive materials, but as the name of one of the greatest minds in history. But that's not the timeline we live in. We live in the darkest timeline, where idiots run the world. I've developed a fondness for oatmeal raisin cookies, and David was free to build his reactor in secret. His chosen site for the build? The potting shed, which he christened the Big D Nuclear Power Plant, because he was also not great at naming stuff. But unlike real nuclear power plants, where employees are supplied with masks, protective eyewear, special suits, and lead-lined rooms, David was just gonna raw dog this reactor with no protection other than a lead apron procured by Professor David Hahn. So David finally set to work. In order to make his neutron gun, he took a large block of lead and scooped out a large hole in it with a chisel. Then he sanded the hole smooth. This is where the alpha emitter, the combination of beryllium and radium, or aluminum and americium, would go. Then he poked a hole through the lead block with a needle. This is where the neutrons would be fired out of the alpha emitter core. And next, he needed radium. At first, it seemed like this would be much easier. He just needed to find a bunch of antique clocks and harvest the radium paint used to apply the numbers to the clock face. David started hunting around every garage sale and antique shop he could find. He went through the basements and attics of friends and family. After several weeks, he had a stack of radium clocks and set about the tedious job of chipping off the paint. After 2 days, he gathered up the spoils of his labor and realized one thing. This was nowhere near enough radium for his neutron gun. He'd need hundreds more clocks, weeks more chiseling. So it was back to americium as his main alpha emitter. But he was in the same boat as the radium. He could only harvest tiny amounts of americium from smoke detectors, and he'd need hundreds of them to get enough of the materials for his neutron gun. He then learned that certain companies were selling expired smoke detectors for cheap, called them up and convinced one of them to sell him 100 for $1 a piece. One day, while Ken and Kathy were at work, David stripped the americium out of the smoke detectors, welded it together, and combined it with strips of aluminum to make the alpha emitter. He was ready to test his neutron gun. Now he just needed the final element, something fissionable that could produce radioactive fuel. Then and only then could he become the Doogie Howser of mad scientists. He needed uranium, but he didn't have nearly enough gas lantern mantle to harvest enough thorium to synthesize it. This was just an endless fetch quest of increasingly impossible tasks. But here's the thing. That was actually the best case scenario, because since David never read any of the negative stuff about nuclear energy, he had no idea that in reality, he wasn't creating a breeder reactor. If he had successfully produced uranium through his method and fired his neutron gun through it, he would have produced plutonium, the most deadly substance on Earth, and he almost certainly would have died, and maybe taken out half of his neighborhood with him. So, fortunately for himself and everyone, he had to scrap his plans to use uranium ore and go back to the drawing board. So David returned to the idea of using thorium, but he was going to need a lot more than what was contained in the existing gas lantern mantles he scrounged together, and he couldn't afford to buy more lanterns at retail value, nor did he think he could reasonably convince anybody to give Professor David Hahn hundreds of them. So what he did instead was approach and befriend a stockroom employee at a camping supply store and paid him to hand over hundreds of the replacement thorium dioxide coated mantles. I know that everything I've talked about in this story so far with David paints him as being this strange, abnormal, outsider, loner with no friends, but also at the same time, when you read the story, he had this preternatural ability to just convince people of things and befriend people in order to get what he wanted out of them, which I just wish I had been a fly on the wall for some of these conversations, because he seemed to have this strange charisma that I just can't even fathom, and I would just love to have seen him work his magic. After David's friend had embezzled enough of these mantles for him, he spent days unwrapping and melting them down to ash with a blowtorch in the potting shed. But he wasn't quite there. He still needed to purify the thorium dioxide into pure thorium before it could be fissionable. Now, David had read in one of his father's textbooks that lithium could be used to purify thorium. Essentially, the lithium is able to absorb certain compounds just by touching them. And when it absorbs the compound, it passes its lithium into the compound it's touching. So David could get the thorium dioxide ash and the lithium to switch bodies, like a Freaky Friday type thing, but with dangerous chemicals. Well, at the time, in the early 90s, lithium batteries were becoming more commonly available through the popularity of devices like cell phones and laptop computers. And so, David just started straight up shoplifting them from stores. He was past the Rubicon at this point. Nothing as trivial as not having money or access to lithium was going to stand in the way of him executing his master plan. He now had all of the elements ready to build his breeder reactor for real and see if he had the stuff to become the next great scientist. But things weren't going to go exactly the way David planned them. Not by a long shot. After all that time melting lantern mantles, haggling for smoke detectors, and shoplifting lithium batteries, David had a random stroke of luck. He wandered into an antique shop one day and started scanning the clocks with his Geiger counter. They all gave faint clicks, but there was nothing worth buying. Then he went up to a particular clock and his counter started reading off the charts. He immediately bought the clock, took it home, opened it up, and discovered that inside there was an entire full vial of sealed radium paint. Likely something left inside of the clock so that the owner could touch up the numbers when they started to fade. But at any rate, David was now back in the radium game. He decided to scrap his entire old reactor. He was going to build a brand new, larger neutron gun and use this glorious cache of radium to generate more powerful neutrons. Whew, sorry, I had to take a sweat break. The Mystery Treehouse is not air conditioned. Now it was time to test the breeder reactor. He took his neutron gun, his purified thorium, and headed into the potting shed. He set down the thorium and took the neutron gun and pointed its needle-sized barrel hole directly at them. After hours went by, he went back out to the shed, consulted his Geiger counter, and nothing. The neutrons were moving too fast to actually absorb into the thorium, and needed to be slowed down using a filter between the gun and the compound. He needed to create his filter out of tritium, another radioactive compound. And after doing some research, David discovered that it could be found in gun sights. He, once again, couldn't afford to just go buying dozens of these things willy-nilly, apparently had trouble connecting with any of the employees of any local gun stores, and maybe felt like shoplifting from a place that exclusively sells guns might be asking for trouble. So instead, what he did was go to one of these gun stores, convince them to let him borrow dozens of gun sights for a demonstration at his high school. The owners were apparently overjoyed at the prospect of someone introducing their entire impressionable student body to the wonders of guns, and agreed. David took the sights home, removed the tritium, and returned them the next day. The classic switcheroo. However, the owner of the store quickly discovered that the sights didn't work anymore, freaked out, called David's parents, and Ken was forced to pay for them all. And instead of, say, asking David what the hell he was doing with a bunch of gun sights, he just demanded that he pay him back, which David did in 4 installments. But it didn't matter anymore. He had the tritium and was ready to try his neutron gun again. So he set up the gun and pointed it at the thorium, this time with the tritium filter, and let it sit for days. And to his delight, this time, the thorium was actually absorbing the neutrons and becoming more and more radioactive. He had actually done it. By himself. There was just one problem though. Much to David's growing horror, the radiation levels kept rising. Soon he was able to pick up huge spikes of radioactivity with his Geiger counter through the 2-foot thick concrete wall of the potting shed. He realized that if he let it keep going like this, it would irradiate his entire neighborhood, or maybe the entire town, who knows? He hadn't thought to build an off switch. And thus began the great downfall of David Hahn, Big D nuclear power plant, and David's dreams of becoming a world-famous scientist. David was now picking up radiation on his Geiger counter from 5 houses away, and knew that he needed to shut the thing down immediately. He headed into the potting shed and disassembled the makeshift breeder reactor, putting all of the various components in their own containers. He stored some of the irradiated thorium in a shoebox in his bedroom, and then loaded up the rest of the parts into the trunk of his car and drove back to his father's house in Clinton Township. Before David had figured out what to do next, he got a surprise. The police showed up at his dad's house and questioned him. Someone called the cops on him thinking that he was stealing tires from a car when he was loading all of his breeder reactor parts into the trunk, which is a very bizarre assumption to make. But I guess in this situation, random nosy neighborhood Karens did the right thing. They eventually opened the trunk thinking they'd found these stolen tires, but instead, they found a bunch of weird gray powder, old antique clocks, random metal parts, and a toolbox sealed shut by duct tape. They, of course, asked David what it was, but he refused to tell them, other than warning not to touch the powder because it was radioactive. Whew, these videos are gonna get a lot less slippery once winter comes. Plus, you can see my sweater collection. With just that information to go on, the police became suspicious that they were dealing with an atomic bomb, homemade by some teenage terrorist. They arrested David and impounded his car along with the breeder reactor parts. Ken was called and arrived at the police station to be greeted by police detectives, telling them that his son may have built an atomic bomb. The police and Ken tried to get answers out of David, but he refused to say anything more than that they should stay away from the trunk of his car. After the bomb squad got the trunk open and inspected the contents, they determined that it was not any kind of bomb, but they did call the DPH, thinking that the whole thing was a bit out of their element. And the DPH members that arrived on the scene had slightly worse news. After testing it out, the contents of David's trunk were extremely radioactive. This triggered an automatic response that required that the DOE, the EPA, the NRC, and the FBI had to be called in. Enough alphabet agencies were brought on the scene to give any conspiracy theorist a freaking heart attack. They decided to search Ken and Kathy's house in Clinton Township to make sure. They were extremely relieved to discover that the house seemed clean and that all of the radioactive materials were confined to David's car. They had zero clue that he'd actually been conducting his nuclear experiments at his mom's house. They didn't even know his mom existed. They assumed that Kathy was his mom, and Ken was too oblivious to say otherwise. In fact, nobody ever even told Patty about the incident. David didn't want to tell her, obviously, and it just didn't occur to Ken. Having nothing to keep him on after discovering there was no bomb and satisfied that the radioactive materials were contained to his car, the police released David. However, one of the members of the DPH, a man named Dave Menard, was absolutely astonished that David had been able to get his hands on these radioactive compounds and decided to reach out to him to discuss it further. When he finally got in contact, David told him he had created the irradiated thorium as part of his atomic energy badge in the Boy Scouts, and that he had been very careful while making it, and that the DPH didn't need to worry about any kind of contamination. A few weeks later, he called David again. This time, he wasn't home and his stepmom answered the phone. When he asked Kathy where David was, she told him he was at his mom's house. Mom's house? He suddenly realized what the police, the DPH, the EPA, the FBI, the YMCA, the village people had all missed the first time around. David had a second house. Menard got the number to Patty's house and called David, demanding to know if he'd conducted any of his experiments there. David confessed, telling him about his mom's potting shed. A can of worms had just been opened. In December of that year, some state radiological experts showed up at Michael and Patty's house unannounced and started asking them questions about the incidents that had transpired. Again, Patty knew nothing about the breeder reactor or the arrest. The radiological experts searched the house and the potting shed, scanning things with their Geiger counters. And while they definitely discovered higher than normal levels of radiation coming from the shed, they were relieved to find that the situation seemed to be minor. They thanked Patty and Michael and left. What they didn't know was that after David got the phone call from Menard, he confessed the situation to Michael and Patty. Patty and Michael became terrified that the government was going to take their house away and declare it condemned or something. And so they immediately set about collecting all the junk from inside the potting shed and David's room and drove it out to a local dump. But the trouble wasn't over. On January 25th, 1995, about a month after the radiological experts had inspected the house, the EPA paid a visit. They also didn't find anything particularly radioactive since Patty and Michael had disposed of it. However, they determined that, given the description of the types of experiments David was conducting, upwards of 40,000 residents in the nearby area had been exposed to harmful levels of radiation. That June, an EPA cleanup crew headed out to Michael and Patty's house. They were mystified by what they saw. David's lab looked like something built by a small child. Signs he had handwritten and hung on the potting shed were horribly misspelled, and yet they had learned that the kids successfully synthesized purified thorium. They wanted to meet him, but never got the chance. During the 3-day cleanup, David stayed at his grandma's house. In fact, Michael and Patty also stayed away from the house. The only people who were around to witness the group of hazmat suit-clad EPA members stripping apart the potting shed and surveying the area were the neighbors, who were becoming incredibly concerned about what was going on and what it meant for them. That was the point at which someone inevitably contacted the local press, who showed up at the house and began covering the mysterious events. By the next day, several local newspapers and stations had run with the story, and David Hahn's name was plastered all over them. But things got even crazier when the New York Post ran a story about David. John Sims, Kathy's father, who had originally given David the Golden Book of Chemistry all those years ago, opened up the paper one day to see a story about a young boy from Detroit who had messed around with nuclear compounds in his backyard. This article didn't even actually feature David's name because I guess these bigger papers had a bit more ethics than the smaller local ones. But John took one look at it and knew it was about David. A few days later, the EPA finished knocking down the potting shed and loaded it and everything else they could find into a truck. But after this, David fell into a deep depression. All of his work was gone. The months and years he'd spent accumulating all the materials and assembling them into a breeder reactor were completely wasted. Afterwards, he sent in his official request for Eagle Scout status and actually got accepted. He also had his 15 minutes of fame and couldn't help but be flattered by the media attention. In fact, it was the perfect opportunity to get back at some of the kids at school who had always doubted his stories of conducting complex experiments with nuclear energy. So for a while, he'd literally just walk around the halls of his high school, handing copies of newspapers featuring stories about him to his bullies. All things aside, that's a level of power fantasy coming true that most of us could only ever dream of. Eventually, kids at school came up with a new nickname for him, the Radioactive Boy Scout, which I gotta be honest, is a way better name than Nerd Boy or Science Boy. Like, they upped their game. All the while, nobody thought to just talk to the boy, ask him how he felt, why he did these things. They never considered for a moment that a young boy with this level of skill and talent could put it towards something truly great if he had just someone to give him advice or guidance. All of the adults in his life wanted to avoid the subject and protect their own interests. David was nothing more than a liability to most of the town. Then, finally, Heather broke up with David. The final straw came when she tried to have some balloons delivered to him in class for Valentine's Day, only to have them seized by the principal because he feared they might be filled with some toxic gas. She, understandably, didn't want to live the rest of her life being thought of as an accomplice for a domestic terrorist in the eyes of society. David was crushed, and it only compounded with his existing depression. Then, even more tragically, after years, decades, suffering from mental illness and crippling alcoholism, David's mother, Patty, shot and killed herself in her home. David was utterly devastated, in shock, and completely despondent. He became completely withdrawn, spending most of his time lying in bed. Eventually, Ken decided enough was enough and told David that he had two choices. Either he could join the military or be kicked out onto the streets. What a great dad. So, David chose the first option and enlisted in the Navy. And against all odds, upon shipping out, he was placed on the USS Enterprise, not the one from Star Trek, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. David served a 4-year naval tour and left at the age of 24 as an interior communications specialist with the rank of petty officer. He returned back to Clinton Township to live with Ken and Kathy, enrolling in another community college for a degree in applied sciences. It was around this time that he met with a journalist named Ken Silverstein, who learned of David and wanted to interview him. Silverstein went on to write an article and then a book about David called The Radioactive Boy Scout, that the brunt of the research for this video came from. David eventually got into hard living, taking drugs such as fentanyl as a way of self-medicating against a lifetime of trauma. In 2007, several smoke detectors went missing in the apartment complex where David was living. He was immediately suspected because the local police were aware of him. They raided his apartment and discovered that he did have the stolen smoke detectors. He was arrested and pleaded guilty to larceny, sentenced to 90 days in jail. Not a whole lot is known about David after that. The book on his life had already literally been written, and he completely fell off the radar. We wouldn't see the radioactive Boy Scout pop back up in the public consciousness until 2016, when he was found dead in his home as a result of a deadly combination of fentanyl and alcohol. Despite the extremely dangerous experiments he had conducted for a decade as a teenager, full of explosions and toxic gases and flying shrapnel, and despite the almost certainly astronomical levels of deadly radiation he had been exposed to, it wasn't the science that killed him. It was the drugs he took to cope. The ultimate sad punctuation mark to a story whose main theme is, for God's sake, just talk to your kids. When being interviewed by Ken Silverstein for his book back in 1998, David said that the only goal he had in life was to be as happy as he was during those days alone in the potting shed, working on his experiments as a kid. One might wonder how it's possibly true that those were the happiest moments of his life. Lonely and isolated, forced to conduct his experiments in secret, unable to confide in anybody or get any guidance, completely shunned by his peers and ignored by all the adults in his life. But I can relate, and I think you can too. When you become solely fixated on a singular goal, an unwavering pursuit of accomplishing one great thing, it can feel like those moments when you finally slip into gear and it's just you and the work building off of each other are the only times you're truly alive. It's sometimes a real challenge to be present outside of those moments, to slow down and experience the life around your singular goal, your work, to grasp onto anything else. And so it's easy to embrace, deify those fleeting moments when you're fully there and the feedback of the human experience is actually clicking. I can totally see David Hahn thinking back and viewing those times as the only happy ones he had, especially considering that outside of them, nobody was trying to connect with him in any kind of meaningful way. But as I'm sure David knew full and well, and would come to realize in those long, dark nights of isolation he most certainly experienced for most of his life, in obsessing over those moments of clarity and inspiration, you let the rest of your life slip by you, sliding through your fingers like lengths of silk being pulled away by some unseen force. There's a nexus point when that binding obsession, that uncompromising monastic dedication to that one thing, destroys you, shoots you into the future, only to wake up and realize everything you've let pass you by. And maybe if there had been anybody in David's life who wanted to help him grasp onto the moments outside of his obsession, like registration marks of love, he could have had better examples of happiness to carry into his adulthood, ones that would have been easier to achieve. And maybe that could have been okay. Thank you so much for watching my video. This is my first attempt at a long-form video for this YouTube channel. It's been really exciting to see this channel grow so quickly. This story is very personal to me and something, a story that I really connect with. I've got to be honest, David Hahn reminds me a lot of myself as a kid, and that's why this story resonates with me so deeply. But I'd like to hear what type of videos you want to see from me. What type of topics? What approach to making videos? What did you think about the way that I told the story? Let me know any kind of feedback in the comments. Please subscribe to my channel so that you can watch future videos from me like this, and also my shorts, which I'm going to be putting out weekly. You can also listen to my podcast. It's called Deep Cuts, and it's basically a show where we do 1.5 hour to upwards of 3-hour deep dive explainers on fascinating true stories from pop culture. If you like what I'm doing here, you're probably going to like the podcast. That's the Deep Cuts podcast. It's on YouTube, just search it, or it's on any other podcast platform that you prefer. So check it out. And once again, thank you.